broken roads meet. Lady Emmeline of Dunmore had spent years surviving the deadly intrigues of court. But when Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's silent enforcer, caught her in a treasonous act, she knew her life now rested in his hands. He leaned in, voice like a blade. "You have made a grave mistake, my lady," he murmured. "Tell me, will you beg, or will you fight?" Chapter 1. The Serpent's Kiss. The air in the Queen's antechamber hung thick with the scent of beeswax and fear. Lady Emmeline of Dunmore knelt before the cold hearth, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the stone mantelpiece. Outside, the wind howled a mournful dirge, mirroring the tempest brewing within her own heart. She had played the game of court for years, navigating its treacherous currents with a practiced grace, but tonight, the tide had turned. Tonight she had been caught. Emmeline's reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of a silver hand mirror lying discarded on a nearby table. A woman of 32 years, her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with silver, a testament to the constant stress of her position. Her eyes, once a lively hazel, were now shadowed with weariness, yet still held a flicker of defiance. The fine lines etched around her mouth spoke of suppressed smiles and unshed tears, a map of a life lived in the shadow of the throne. Her gown, a deep emerald velvet, was the color of hidden secrets, a subtle reminder of the forests surrounding her ancestral home, Dunmore, a place she hadn't seen in years, a place of safety she might never see again. The summons had come swiftly, brutally efficient, like the strike of a hawk. A single, sealed parchment delivered by a silent page, the Queen's crimson seal a glaring accusation.
Attends-me.
Immediately. No warmth, no courtesy, just the cold command of a monarch who held Emmeline's life in her delicate, jeweled hands. Queen Isolde was a viper in silk, beautiful and deadly. Her beauty was legendary, her hair the color of spun gold, her eyes a piercing sapphire blue. But her heart, Emmeline knew, was as cold and hard as the diamonds that adorned her crown. Isolde trusted no one, and her favor was as fickle as the wind. Emmeline had danced attendance on her for a decade, playing the part of the loyal, if somewhat distant, kinswoman. She had learned to anticipate the Queen's moods, to flatter her vanity, to deflect her suspicion. She had survived. Until now. The treasonous act had been a desperate gamble, a necessary risk. A letter, smuggled out of the castle walls, containing information that could sway the balance of power in the kingdom. Information that could protect her family, her people, from the Queen's increasingly erratic and cruel decrees. The recipient? Her brother, Lord Alaric of Dunmore, a man who held the northern borders against constant threat, a man whose loyalty to the crown was now overshadowed by his loyalty to his own. She had known the risks. She had weighed them carefully, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. But the thought of Dunmore, of its rolling hills and sturdy people, had steeled her resolve. She had chosen her path, and now she would face the consequences. The heavy oak door to the antechamber creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the flickering torchlight in the corridor. He moved with a silent grace, a predator entering its lair. Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's enforcer, the hound of the crown. Emmeline rose slowly, her knees protesting after the long hours of waiting. She smoothed the folds of her velvet gown, a futile attempt to regain some semblance of composure. She would not cower. She would not beg. She was a daughter of Dunmore, and she would face this, as she had faced everything else in her life, with her head held high. Roderick Locksley was a man forged of steel and shadow. Tall and powerfully built, he moved with the controlled strength of a seasoned warrior. His face was a study in contrasts, hard angles and sharp planes, framed by dark hair that showed no trace of silver. His eyes, a cold, piercing gray, seemed to see through her, stripping away her carefully constructed facade. He wore no elaborate finery, only a simple black tunic and leather jerkin, the only adornment a silver wolf's head pendant, the symbol of his house, resting against his broad chest. His sword, sheathed at his side, was legendary, its blade said to be as sharp as his wit and as unforgiving as his justice. He stopped before her, his presence filling the small room, his silence more threatening than any shouted accusation. The scent of leather and steel, of the cold night air that clung to his cloak, filled her senses. He studied her, his gaze unwavering, assessing, judging. The weight of that gaze was almost unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble, devoid of any emotion. "Lady Emmeline of Dunmore." It was not a question, but a statement of fact, a pronouncement of her doom. "Sir Roderick," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. She met his gaze, refusing to flinch, refusing to show the fear that gnawed at her insides. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper, the sound like the rasp of a blade being drawn from its scabbard. "You have made a grave mistake, my lady," he murmured. "Tell me, will you beg, or will you fight?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was not a question of innocence or guilt. He knew. She knew he knew. It was a question of how she would face her end. Would she grovel, plead for mercy, offer bribes, betray others to save herself? Or would she stand defiant, accepting her fate with the courage that flowed in her blood, the courage of the North? Emmeline's chin lifted a fraction. Her fingers, hidden within the folds of her gown, clenched into fists. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else had stirred within her, something she had thought long dead. A spark of defiance, a flicker of hope, a refusal to be broken. "I am not afraid of you, Sir Roderick," she said, her voice low but clear. "I have made my choices, and I will face the consequences. I will not beg, but I will not surrender." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps even respect crossed his features, a fleeting expression quickly masked by his usual impassivity. He straightened, his hand moving to rest on the pommel of his sword, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "Brave words, my lady," he said, his voice still a low rumble. "But bravery alone will not save you. The Queen demands an answer, and she will have it, one way or another." He turned and walked towards the door, his back to her, a broad, imposing silhouette against the flickering light. "Come," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "Your audience with Her Majesty awaits." Emmeline hesitated for a moment, her gaze sweeping the familiar room, a silent farewell to the life she had known. Then, with a deep breath, she followed him, her footsteps echoing in the silent corridor, each step bringing her closer to her fate, a fate that now rested in the hands of the silent, deadly night and the cruel, unforgiving Queen. The game was far from over, and now, more than her own life hung precariously in the balance, swaying like a pendulum poised between a serpent's venomous kiss and a knight's steel embrace. Chapter 2. A Knight's Shadow. The walk to the Queen's private chambers felt like a journey to the executioner's block. Each echoing footstep on the cold stone floor, each flicker of torchlight on the tapestries depicting ancient battles and mythical beasts, served as a stark reminder of Emmeline's precarious situation. Sir Roderick walked ahead, a silent, imposing shadow, his presence a constant pressure at her back. He did not speak, did not even glance at her, yet she felt his awareness of her every move, every breath. The corridors of the royal palace were a labyrinth of power and intrigue. Emmeline had navigated them for years, learning to read the subtle cues, the whispered conversations, the veiled threats. She knew the faces, the alliances, the rivalries that simmered beneath the veneer of courtly manners. But tonight, the familiar surroundings felt alien, hostile. Every servant who bowed low, every guard who snapped to attention, seemed to be watching her, judging her, condemning her. She tried to focus on her breathing, to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She had faced danger before, threats both physical and political. She had learned to mask her fear, to present a facade of calm control. But this was different. This was Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's unwavering right hand, the man who dispensed justice without mercy, the man who held her fate in his grip. She stole a glance at his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark hair brushed the collar of his tunic. He was an enigma, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. He was known for his unwavering loyalty to the king, his ruthless efficiency in carrying out his orders. Rumors swirled around him, whispers of a past shrouded in tragedy, of a lost love, of a heart turned to stone. But Emmeline had never paid much attention to the gossip. He was simply a tool of the crown, a weapon to be wielded against its enemies. And now, she was that enemy. She wondered what he thought of her actions. Did he see her as a traitor, a threat to the kingdom? Or did he see something more, something beneath the surface? Did he, perhaps, understand the desperation that had driven her to such a risk? She doubted it. He was a knight, bound by oaths of loyalty, by a code of honor that left little room for understanding, for compassion. They reached the queen's antechamber, a smaller, more intimate space than the grand hall where Emmeline had waited before. 2 guards stood at attention outside the heavy oak doors, their faces impassive, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Roderick nodded to them, and they swung the doors open, revealing the opulent chamber beyond. The room was bathed in the warm glow of candlelight, the air thick with the scent of incense and roses. Tapestries depicting scenes of courtly love and chivalric deeds adorned the walls, a stark contrast to the harsh reality of the situation. Queen Isolde sat on a raised dais, her throne a masterpiece of carved ivory and gold. She was dressed in a gown of shimmering silver silk, her golden hair cascading down her back, her sapphire eyes sparkling with a cold fire. She looked every inch the regal monarch, beautiful, powerful, and utterly ruthless. Emmeline curtsied deeply, her head bowed, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel the queen's gaze upon her, sharp and penetrating, like a hawk assessing its prey. Roderick stepped forward, bowing low before the queen. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice respectful, but devoid of any warmth. "I have brought Lady Emmeline of Dunmore, as you commanded." The queen's lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Ah, Emmeline," she said, her voice soft, almost musical, yet laced with a subtle threat. "So good of you to join us." Emmeline remained silent, her head bowed, waiting for the queen to speak. She knew better than to interrupt, than to offer any excuses or explanations. The queen would play her game, draw out the suspense, savor the moment of her power. "You have been a loyal servant, Emmeline," the queen continued, her voice still deceptively gentle. "A trusted member of my court. A kinswoman, even. I have always valued your counsel, your discretion." Emmeline felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the darkness. Perhaps the queen was not entirely convinced of her guilt. Perhaps there was still a chance, however slim, to salvage the situation. But the queen's next words dashed that hope against the rocks. "Which is why I am so deeply disappointed," she said, her voice hardening, the sweetness replaced by a chilling steeliness. "To discover that you have betrayed my trust, that you have conspired against me, against the crown." The queen's eyes, usually a brilliant, almost mesmerizing blue, had darkened with a glacial fury. Emmeline kept her gaze lowered, knowing that meeting the queen's wrathful stare directly would be seen as defiance. A long, agonizing silence filled the chamber. The weight of her actions bore on Emmeline. She had been prepared to face punishment, had steeled herself for imprisonment, even death. But the cold disdain in the queen's voice was a torment she hadn't anticipated. "The evidence, Sir Roderick," the queen commanded, her voice sharp as shattered glass. Roderick stepped forward, producing a small, folded parchment from within his tunic. It was the letter. Emmeline's heart sank. She recognized the seal, her own family crest, broken but unmistakable. He handed the letter to the queen, who unfolded it with a delicate, almost mocking slowness. She scanned the contents, her lips tightening with each passing moment. Then, she looked up at Emmeline, her eyes blazing with fury. "This," she said, her voice trembling with rage, "is treason, Emmeline. Pure and simple. You have aided and abetted the enemies of the crown. You have conspired with your brother, that rebellious northern lord, to undermine my authority. Emmeline finally lifted her head, meeting the queen's gaze. She would not cower, not anymore. "My queen," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I acted to protect my people. Your decrees have been unjust. They have brought hardship and suffering to Dunmore." The queen laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Unjust? You dare to question my judgment? You, a mere lady, a pawn in my court? I am a daughter of Dunmore," Emmeline retorted, her voice rising slightly. "And I have a duty to my people. I will not stand idly by while they suffer." The queen rose from her throne, her movements swift and graceful, like a predator about to strike. She approached Emmeline, her eyes narrowed, her face contorted with rage. "You forget your place, Emmeline," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You are my subject. You owe me your loyalty, your obedience. And you have betrayed me." She raised her hand, and for a moment, Emmeline thought she would strike her. But then, the queen lowered her hand, a slow, deliberate movement. "I could have you executed," she said, her voice cold and calculating. "I could have you thrown into the dungeons, to rot and die. But I am not without mercy." Emmeline felt a flicker of hope, a desperate yearning for a reprieve. But she knew the queen too well. Mercy was not a word in her vocabulary. "I will give you a choice, Emmeline," the queen continued, her voice softening, becoming almost seductive. "A chance to redeem yourself. A chance to prove your loyalty." Emmeline waited, her breath held captive in her chest, her mind racing, trying to anticipate the queen's next move. What game was she playing now? What price would she demand for this so-called mercy? The queen's smile returned, a cruel, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Emmeline's spine. "You will marry Sir Roderick Locksley," she said, her voice dripping with a sinister sweetness. "And you will become his wife. His spy. His weapon." Emmeline stared at the queen, speechless, stunned by the sheer audacity of the proposal. Marry Roderick Locksley? The cold, unfeeling knight? The man who had brought her to this very precipice? It was unthinkable. It was impossible. And it would seal her fate even tighter than the letter ever could. It was either submit or face the executioner. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Stone. The queen's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the velvet drapes that adorned the chamber walls. Marry Sir Roderick Locksley? The proposition was so outrageous, so utterly unexpected, that Emmeline could only stare at the queen in stunned silence. Her mind, already reeling from the accusation of treason, struggled to grasp the implications of this new, even more terrifying development. She glanced at Roderick, seeking some reaction, some sign of protest, of disbelief. But his face remained impassive, a mask of stone, revealing nothing of his thoughts or feelings. He stood silently, his gaze fixed on the queen, his posture unwavering, the perfect embodiment of the loyal, obedient knight. He was as shocked as she, this she could glean. But unlike her, his reactions were shrouded, buried deep beneath a wall of iron control. You cannot be serious, Your Majesty," Emmeline finally stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt hollow, inadequate, a futile protest against the inevitable. The queen's smile widened, a predatory gleam in her sapphire eyes. "Oh, but I am, Emmeline, perfectly serious. It is a most fitting solution, don't you think? You will be bound to my most loyal servant, your every move watched, your every thought scrutinized. You will be my eyes and ears in the north, reporting on your brother's activities, ensuring his continued compliance." Emmeline felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment at the queen's manipulation. She was being used, a pawn in a deadly game of power, her life, her future, sacrificed to the queen's insatiable ambition. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. The queen's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "Then you will face the consequences of your treason, Emmeline. You will be stripped of your title, your lands, your very life. Your brother will be branded a traitor, and Dunmore will suffer the full force of my wrath. The threat was clear, unmistakable. Refusal was not an option. She was trapped, cornered, with no escape. The queen had her precisely where she wanted her, bound by duty, by fear, by the threat to her family and her people. She looked at Roderick again, searching for some glimmer of humanity, some hint of compassion in his cold, gray eyes. But he remained unreadable, a silent sentinel, guarding the gates of her prison. This is madness, Emmeline whispered, her voice choked with despair. I cannot marry a man I do not know, a man I fear. The queen chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent shivers down Emmeline's spine. Fear? Perhaps. But also respect, Emmeline. Sir Roderick is a man of honor, a man of strength. He will protect you, provide for you, and he will keep you in line. Emmeline felt a surge of defiance, a spark of rebellion against the queen's control. I am not a child to be ordered about, she retorted, her voice rising slightly. I am a lady of Dunmore, and I will not be treated like a chattel. The queen's eyes narrowed, her face hardening. You will do as you are told, Emmeline, or you will suffer the consequences. The choice is yours. Emmeline knew she had no choice. She was trapped. She could either submit to the queen's will, marrying a man she barely knew, a man who represented everything she feared, or she could face the destruction of everything she held dear. Her family, her people, Dunmore itself, would be crushed beneath the queen's ruthless power. She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She had always been strong, resilient, able to navigate the treacherous waters of court. But this was beyond anything she had ever faced. This was a betrayal, a violation, a complete and utter subjugation of her will. When she opened her eyes, she saw Roderick watching her, his gaze intense, unwavering. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes, a fleeting expression that she couldn't quite decipher. Was it pity? Contempt? Or something else entirely? I accept, she said, her voice barely audible, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. The surrender felt like a physical blow, a defeat that resonated deep within her soul. The queen smiled, a triumphant, satisfied smile. Excellent. I knew you would see reason, Emmeline. The wedding will take place within the week. Sir Roderick, you will make the necessary arrangements. Roderick bowed his head. As you command, your majesty. He turned to Emmeline, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary. Lady Emmeline, he said, his voice low and formal, I will escort you to your chambers. She nodded, unable to speak, her mind still reeling from the shock of the queen's decree. She followed him out of the chamber, her steps heavy, her heart leaden with despair. As they walked through the silent corridors, Emmeline felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. She had been forced into a marriage with a man she barely knew, a man who was known for his ruthlessness, his unwavering loyalty to the crown. But there was something else about him, something that intrigued her, something that she couldn't quite define. She stole another glance at his profile, the strong jaw, the high cheekbones, the dark hair that fell across his forehead. He was undeniably handsome, in a rugged, unconventional way. But it was his eyes that held her attention, those cold, gray eyes that seemed to see right through her. Why? She asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Why did you not protest? Why did you not refuse? He stopped, turning to face her, his gaze intense. My duty is to the crown, Lady Emmeline, he said, his voice low and even. I do as I am commanded. But surely you have some feelings about this, she persisted, her voice trembling slightly. This is your life, too. You are being forced to marry a woman you do not know, a woman who has been accused of treason. He remained silent for a moment, his gaze searching hers. Then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I have learned to not question the will of the king or the queen. He paused, a shadow crossing his face. And it has to be said that sometimes duty provides its very own unexpected opportunities. Emmeline was startled to realize that the opportunity he spoke of wasn't focused solely on the Queen's agenda. There was a secondary meaning, almost imperceptible, a consideration for his future. Herself. The corridor was narrow, dimly lit by a single torch sconced high on the stone wall. The flickering light cast dancing shadows, creating an illusion of intimacy, of shared secrets. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. Opportunities? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. She was standing in shadows and light, the duality perfectly mirroring the position she'd been forced to inhabit. His eyes flickered. To serve, he answered with a neutral tone that belied the careful choice of his words. Or, to be served. Emmeline whispered before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted her boldness. She had spent years at court learning to be subtle, to choose her words with care. But this man, this situation, seemed to unravel her carefully constructed composure. Roderick's expression did not change, but she could see the subtle twitch of a muscle in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. "I know my place in the court, and you, my lady, will learn yours," he said, a subtle hint of something warning? Promise? Underlying his words. "But as a husband, the order is different, my lady. And the possibilities far greater." The implied intimacy in his words, spoken in the hushed quiet of the stone corridor, sent a shiver through her. Not entirely of fear. She had been a pawn. Now, she was being forced to become a player, and a player beside a man she knew nothing about, only that he might be as complicated and trapped as she. The whispers in the stone felt almost conspiratorial. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity, a whirlwind of preparations that left Emmeline feeling numb and detached. She went through the motions, attending fittings for her wedding gown, meeting with the castle chaplain, enduring the endless stream of well-wishers and curious onlookers. But her mind was elsewhere, lost in a maze of fear, resentment, and a strange, unsettling curiosity about the man she was being forced to marry. The gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and lace, embroidered with pearls and silver thread. It was a dress fit for a queen, a symbol of the wealth and power of the royal court. But to Emmeline, it felt like a shroud, a symbol of her captivity, of the life she was being forced to leave behind. The castle chaplain, a portly, jovial man named Father Michael, spoke to her of the sanctity of marriage, of the vows she would be taking, of the duties of a wife. But his words seemed hollow, meaningless, given the circumstances of her union. She was not marrying for love, for companionship, for any of the reasons that most women entered into marriage. She was marrying out of duty, out of fear, out of a desperate attempt to save her family and her people. The well-wishers, the ladies of the court, the visiting nobles, all offered their congratulations, their smiles bright and insincere. They whispered behind their fans, speculating about the match, about the Queen's motives, about Emmeline's future. She endured their scrutiny, their veiled curiosity, with a practiced grace, her face a mask of polite composure. Roderick remained a distant, enigmatic figure throughout the preparations. He was present, fulfilling his duties, overseeing the arrangements, but he made no attempt to engage with her on a personal level. He treated her with a formal courtesy, addressing her as Lady Emmeline, his voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. He was a constant presence, a silent shadow, reminding her of the fate that awaited her. She tried to learn more about him, asking discreet questions of the servants, of the other knights, of anyone who might have some insight into his character. But the answers she received were vague, contradictory, shrouded in rumor and speculation. He was a skilled warrior, a brilliant strategist, a man of unwavering loyalty. He was also a loner, a man of few friends, a man who kept his emotions tightly guarded. Some whispered of a tragic past, of a lost love, of a heart broken beyond repair. Others spoke of his ruthlessness, his cold efficiency in carrying out the king's orders. The more she learned, the more confused she became. He was an enigma, a puzzle she couldn't solve. And yet, she found herself increasingly drawn to him, intrigued by the mystery that surrounded him. She caught herself watching him, studying his face, his movements, searching for some clue to the man beneath the mask. One evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, staring out the window at the darkening sky, she heard a knock at the door. She turned, her heart pounding, expecting to see one of the servants, or perhaps one of the Queen's ladies in waiting. But it was Roderick, standing in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, his presence both imposing and strangely comforting. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice low and formal. "May I have a word?" She nodded, her throat dry, her hands trembling slightly. She gestured for him to enter, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the details, the tapestries, the furniture, the small fire burning in the hearth. "The wedding is in 2 days," he said, his voice still formal, but with a hint of something else. "Uncertainty? Apprehension?" "I am aware," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to face her, his gray eyes meeting hers. "I know this is not what you wanted," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "I know you are being forced into this, against your will." Emmeline felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of anger, resentment, and a surprising wave of gratitude. He understood. He saw her, not just as a pawn in the Queen's game, but as a woman, a person with feelings, with fears, with desires. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for acknowledging that." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I am not a monster, Lady Emmeline," he said. "I may be a knight, bound by duty, but I am not without compassion." She searched his face, looking for some sign of deception, some hint of insincerity. But she saw only honesty, a raw vulnerability that surprised her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice still low, but with a newfound boldness. "Why are you agreeing to this marriage? You could have refused. You could have found a way out." He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly, a rare display of weariness. "I have my reasons," he said, his voice guarded. "Reasons that I cannot share." "Is it about the rumors?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "About the lost love? About the tragedy in your past?" He flinched, his eyes darkening, his jaw tightening. "Those are old wounds, Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice cold and distant. "Wounds that are best left unopened." She regretted her question, realizing that she had crossed a line, intruded upon a private pain. "I am sorry," she said, her voice contrite. "I did not mean to pry." He nodded, accepting her apology, but the wall between them had been rebuilt, the brief moment of connection severed. He cleared his throat, returning to the formal tone he had used before. "I wanted to assure you, Lady Emmeline, that I will honor my vows," he said. "I will protect you, provide for you. I will not force myself upon you." Emmeline felt a wave of relief, a lessening of the fear that had been gnawing at her. He was not a brute. He was not a man who would take advantage of her vulnerability. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "That means a great deal to me." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "We are both prisoners in this, Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice low and somber. "But perhaps we can find a way to survive. To even thrive." His words, spoken with such quiet intensity, sent a shiver down her spine. He was offering her a glimmer of hope, a possibility of something more than mere survival. He was offering her an alliance, a partnership, forged in the crucible of shared adversity. This was to be the price of her silence, and hers to pay with her life. The silence of others, however, would soon be required, and the price would be far higher. For now, the bargain had been struck, in quiet words, a spark of hope ignited in the face of an enforced union. The knight was no longer just a shadow, he was a potential ally. And the Queen's pawn was beginning to see a way to perhaps checkmate the Queen. Chapter 5. Beneath a Hunter's Moon. The night before the wedding, Emmeline found herself unable to sleep. The castle was quiet, the usual bustle of activity hushed in anticipation of the morrow. But her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, fear and resignation battling with a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite name. Curiosity? Hope? Defiance? She rose from her bed, wrapping a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders against the chill of the stone chamber. She walked to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. A full moon, a hunter's moon, hung high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the castle walls, the gardens, the distant forest. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. She thought of Dunmore, of her home, of the familiar sights and sounds of her childhood. She wondered if she would ever see it again, if she would ever escape the gilded cage of the royal court. She thought of her brother, Alaric, and the burden he carried, the responsibility of protecting the northern borders. She hoped that her sacrifice, this forced marriage, would be enough to keep him safe, to keep Dunmore from falling under the Queen's tyrannical control. And she thought of Roderick, the enigmatic knight who was about to become her husband. She replayed their conversation from the previous evening, his words, his tone, the fleeting expressions that had crossed his face. He was not what she had expected. He was not a monster, not a brute. He was a man of duty, yes, but also a man of complexity. A man with hidden depths, with secrets he guarded closely. She found herself drawn to him, despite her fear, despite the circumstances of their union. There was a strength in him, a resilience that she admired. And there was a vulnerability, a hint of sadness, that touched her heart. She wondered what had happened in his past, what had shaped him into the man he was. She wondered if she would ever truly know him, if he would ever allow her to see beneath the mask he wore. A sudden noise startled her, a faint rustling sound from the garden below. She peered down, her eyes straining to see through the shadows. She saw a figure moving stealthily through the rose bushes, a dark cloak concealing their identity. The figure paused, looking up at her window, and for a moment, their eyes met. Emmeline gasped, recognizing the face, even in the dim moonlight. It was Lady Isolde, the Queen's younger sister, a woman known for her beauty, her charm, and her ambition. Lady Isolde was a rival of the Queen, a constant threat to her power. And she was also rumored to be involved with Alaric, Emmeline's brother. What was she doing here, sneaking around the castle gardens in the dead of night? Was she meeting someone? Was she involved in some plot, some conspiracy against the Queen? Emmeline's mind raced, considering the possibilities. This could be important, this could be a way to gain leverage, to protect herself and her family. But it could also be dangerous, a trap, a way to further implicate her in treason. She watched as Lady Isolde disappeared into the shadows, heading towards the small chapel that stood at the edge of the gardens. Emmeline hesitated, her heart pounding, unsure of what to do. Should she follow her? Should she confront her? Or should she remain silent, pretending she had seen nothing? A hand touched her arm, and she jumped, whirling around to face the intruder. It was Roderick, standing in the doorway, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. He had moved with such silence that she hadn't even heard him approach. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I could ask you the same question," he replied, his voice low and even. "I saw you from the corridor. You looked disturbed." She glanced back at the window, at the empty garden. Lady Isolde was gone. "I saw something," she said, her voice hesitant. "Someone in the garden." He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. "Who?" She hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, whether to reveal what she had seen. But she had to tell someone. And he was, after all, about to become her husband. "Lady Isolde," she whispered. "The Queen's sister." His expression changed, a flicker of surprise, of concern, crossing his features. "What was she doing?" "I don't know," Emmeline replied. "She was sneaking around." She looked furtive. He was silent for a moment, his mind clearly working, assessing the situation. "Did she see you?" I think so," Emmeline replied. "We made eye contact." He swore softly under his breath. "This is complicated," he said. "Dangerous." "I know," Emmeline said. "But what does it mean? What is she up to?" He shook his head. "I do not know. But I will find out." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "You must not speak of this to anyone, Emmeline," he said, his voice firm. "Not a word. Do you understand?" But what if she trusts me? He interrupted, his voice low and urgent. This is a matter for the king's justice, not for gossip, not for speculation. Emmeline nodded, her heart still pounding, her mind still racing. She understood the danger, the risk of getting involved in the treacherous game of court politics. But she also felt a sense of excitement, a sense of purpose. She was not just a pawn anymore. She was a player, and she had information, valuable and very dangerous. What are you going to do? She asked. I have to verify your claims, and then I will go to the king. If there are plots against his throne, and there often are, he must know of them. Roderick responded. Tonight? She asked. But the wedding is tomorrow. He finished for her. He looked into her eyes, then at the window and the gardens below. Secrets rarely wait, and the moon is a good hunter, my lady. It shines a light even into the deepest of shadows. Emmeline shivered at the imagery. It was true. The moon above had revealed Lady Isolde's hidden actions. It was also casting light on a darkness that stretched far beyond the castle walls, a darkness that was only now being felt. And tomorrow, she will wed herself into it. Chapter 6. The Falcon and the Dove. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the sun streaming through the stained glass windows of the castle chapel, painting the stone floor with a kaleidoscope of colors. The air was filled with the scent of incense and flowers, the sound of hushed whispers and nervous laughter. Emmeline stood before the altar, dressed in the magnificent ivory gown, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt strangely detached, as if she were watching the scene unfold from afar, a spectator in her own life. The rituals, the prayers, the vows, all seemed to pass in a blur, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of what was happening. She was marrying Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's enforcer, the man she had feared, the man she was now bound to for life. She glanced at him, standing beside her, tall and imposing in his dark velvet doublet, his face a mask of stoic composure. He looked every inch the noble knight, the epitome of strength and duty. But she knew there was more to him than that, a hidden vulnerability, a complexity that she was only beginning to glimpse. He met her gaze, his gray eyes holding hers for a moment, a silent communication passing between them. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of reassurance, of perhaps even tenderness. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual impassivity. The chaplain, Father Michael, droned on, his voice echoing through the chapel, reciting the ancient words of the marriage ceremony. Emmeline repeated the vows, her voice surprisingly steady, her mind focused on the task at hand. She would honor her commitment, she would play her part, she would survive. When it was Roderick's turn to speak, his voice was firm and clear, resonating with a quiet authority. He made the vows without hesitation, his gaze fixed on Emmeline's, his hand clasping hers with a surprising warmth. She felt a strange sense of comfort in his touch, a reassurance that she was not alone in this, that they were in this together, two pawns in a larger game, bound by fate and circumstance. The ceremony concluded, the vows exchanged, the rings placed on their fingers. They were husband and wife, bound by law, by duty, by the Queen's decree. The assembled guests erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the chapel, a celebration of a union that was anything but joyous. Emmeline felt a wave of nausea, a surge of panic, as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She was trapped, bound to a man she barely knew, her future uncertain, her life forever changed. Roderick placed a hand on her arm, his touch gentle, supportive. "Are you all right, my lady?" he asked, his voice low, for her ears only. She nodded, forcing a smile, trying to maintain her composure. "I am fine," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He led her out of the chapel, into the bright sunlight of the courtyard, where the guests were gathered, waiting to offer their congratulations. Emmeline endured the endless stream of well-wishers, the forced smiles, the whispered comments, with a practiced grace. She played the part of the blushing bride, her face a mask of polite happiness, concealing the turmoil within. The feast that followed was a lavish affair, a display of the queen's wealth and power. The great hall was filled with tables laden with food and drink, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats, spices, and wine. Musicians played lively tunes, jesters entertained the guests, and the conversation flowed freely, a mixture of gossip, intrigue, and veiled threats. Emmeline sat beside Roderick at the high table, her appetite non-existent, her mind racing. She felt the eyes of the court upon her, watching her, judging her, speculating about her future. She knew that she was the subject of much gossip, the object of envy and pity. The queen sat at the head of the table, her smile bright and insincere, her eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing, calculating. She raised her glass in a toast, her voice ringing through the hall. "To the happy couple," she proclaimed. "May their union bring peace and prosperity to the kingdom." The guests echoed her toast, their voices loud and enthusiastic. But Emmeline knew that the queen's words were hollow, that her true motives were far more sinister. This marriage was not about peace or prosperity, it was about control, about power, about maintaining her grip on the throne. Roderick leaned towards her, his voice low and discreet. "Do not let her see your fear, Emmeline," he whispered. "She feeds on it." Emmeline nodded, taking a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She would not give the queen the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She would play the game, she would survive, and she would, somehow, find a way to protect herself and her family. As the evening wore on, Emmeline found herself observing the other guests, watching their interactions, listening to their conversations. She noticed the subtle glances, the whispered asides, the veiled threats that passed between the various factions of a court. She saw the ambition, the greed, the envy that simmered beneath the surface of courtly manners. She saw Lady Isolde, the queen's sister, sitting across the hall, her eyes constantly darting towards Emmeline and Roderick. She was dressed in a gown of deep crimson, a color that seemed to symbolize her rebellious nature. She was surrounded by her own coterie of followers, whispering and laughing, their eyes full of a knowing malice. Emmeline felt a shiver of unease, remembering the scene in the garden the previous night. She knew that Lady Isolde was a threat, a danger to both her and Roderick. But she also knew that she could be a valuable source of information, a potential ally in the dangerous game of court politics. It seemed almost sacrilegious comparing her, radiant in red, with a dove. Yet the contrast was needed, for Isolde represented both purity and danger. Roderick was the falcon, strong, watchful, and now officially charged with guarding the seemingly weaker creature. The evening finally drew to a close, the guests departing, the hall emptying. Emmeline felt a wave of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. She had survived the day, the wedding, the feast. But the true test was yet to come. She was now Roderick's wife, and she had to navigate the treacherous waters of their marriage, of their new life together. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past. The bridal chamber was opulent, a vast room dominated by a large four-poster bed draped in heavy velvet curtains. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the tapestried walls. The air was thick with the scent of perfumed candles and fresh flowers. It was a room designed for romance, for intimacy, but for Emmeline, it felt like a prison cell. Roderick stood by the window, his back to her, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. He had shed his fine wedding doublet and was now dressed in a simple linen shirt and dark breeches. He looked less imposing, more human, in the soft candlelight. Emmeline stood by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt awkward, uncomfortable, unsure of what to do, what to say. This was her wedding night, a night that should have been filled with joy, with anticipation, with love. But instead, it was filled with fear, with uncertainty, with a sense of dread. He turned to face her, his gray eyes searching hers. He saw the apprehension, the fear in her eyes. "You do not need to be afraid, Emmeline," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. He had used her given name, without the formal title, a subtle shift in their relationship. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotion. She knew he was trying to reassure her, But the circumstances of their marriage, the forced nature of their union, made it impossible for her to relax, to feel anything but dread. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away, respecting her space, her boundaries. "I gave you my word," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I will not force myself upon you. This marriage, it is a political arrangement, nothing more. At least, for now." Emmeline felt a wave of relief, a lessening of the tension that had been gripping her. She had feared that he would demand his husbandly rights, that he would treat her as a possession, a prize to be claimed. But he was offering her a reprieve, a chance to adjust, to come to terms with their new reality. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That means a great deal to me." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "We are both caught in this web, Emmeline," he said, his voice somber. "But we can help each other. We can be allies." She met his gaze, searching his eyes for any hint of deception, of manipulation. But she saw only honesty, a sincerity that surprised her. He was offering her a partnership, a collaboration, a way to navigate the treacherous waters of their situation. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "The Queen, she intends to use you," he said, his voice low and discreet. "To spy on your brother, to control the North. But you can use me, too, to protect yourself, to protect your family." Emmeline felt a spark of hope, a flicker of defiance. He was right. She could use this marriage, this forced union, to her advantage. She could play the game. She could gather information. She could protect her family and her people. "How?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. "I am the king's enforcer," he said, his voice matter of fact. "I have access to information, to the inner workings of the court. I can shield you to a certain extent. I can warn you of dangers. And what do you gain from this?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "I have my own reasons," he said, his voice guarded. "Reasons that I cannot yet reveal." She remembered the rumors, the whispers of a tragic past, of a lost love. She wondered if his motives were connected to that, to some hidden agenda, some desire for revenge or redemption. "Is it about her?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a surprising empathy. "The woman you lost?" He flinched, his eyes darkening, his jaw tightening. The pain, the grief, was still there, raw and exposed, beneath the surface of his stoic composure. "Her name was Lyra," he said, his voice barely a whisper, the name spoken like a prayer, a lament. "She was everything to me." He turned away from her, walking back to the window, his shoulders slumped, his body tense. Emmeline watched him, her heart aching for him, for the pain he carried. She understood loss, she understood grief. She had lost her own freedom, her own future, to the Queen's machinations. "What happened?" she asked softly, her voice hesitant, unsure whether to intrude upon his private sorrow. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Then he spoke, his voice raw with emotion, the words ripped from the depths of his soul. "She was accused of treason," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Falsely accused. She was executed. By order of the king." Emmeline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. She understood now. She understood his loyalty, his obedience, his unwavering devotion to the crown. He was trying to atone, to make amends, for a wrong he could not prevent, a loss he could not bear. He was trying to protect others, to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. I am so sorry," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. "I could not save her," he said, his voice raw with guilt. "I was powerless. But I can save you, Emmeline. I can protect you." His words, spoken with such intensity, such conviction, sent a shiver down her spine. He was not just offering her an alliance, he was offering her his protection, his strength, his very soul. He had laid bare the scars of his past so that she could see his heart. And now, his vulnerability forged an unexpected bond. "We will protect each other," Emmeline affirmed, her own scars, though different, mirroring his in the shared space of their forced union. Tonight, they weren't the falcon and the dove, but two wounded creatures, seeking solace and perhaps a measure of redemption in each other's presence. Chapter 8. A Dance of Deception. Life at court settled into a new rhythm, a carefully choreographed dance of deception and intrigue. Emmeline played the part of the dutiful wife, attending to Roderick's needs, accompanying him to court functions, maintaining a facade of polite affection. But beneath the surface, their alliance deepened, a silent understanding passing between them, a shared determination to navigate the treacherous waters of the royal court. Roderick, true to his word, used his position as the king's enforcer to shield Emmeline from the queen's more blatant attempts at manipulation. He intercepted messages, deflected suspicions, and subtly warned her of potential dangers. He shared information with her, snippets of conversations overheard, rumors circulating in the court, insights into the queen's plans and strategies. Emmeline, in turn, used her position as Roderick's wife to gather information, to observe the other members of the court, to listen to their whispers, to glean any clues that might be useful to her brother, to Dunmore. She learned to read the subtle cues, the veiled threats, the hidden alliances that simmered beneath the veneer of courtly manners. She found herself drawn to Roderick, despite the circumstances of their marriage. She admired his strength, his intelligence, his unwavering loyalty. She also saw his vulnerability, the pain he carried from his past, the guilt he felt over Lyra's death. She found herself wanting to comfort him, to ease his burden, to offer him the solace he so desperately needed. Their interactions were subtle, discreet, a carefully constructed dance of deception. They spoke in veiled terms, using code words, passing messages through trusted servants. They met in secret, in the quiet corners of the castle, in the moonlit gardens, sharing information, planning their strategies, forging a bond of trust, and something more. Emmeline found herself increasingly attracted to him, drawn to his quiet strength, his hidden vulnerability, the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. She felt a warmth in his presence, a sense of security, a feeling that she was not alone in this, that they were in this together. One evening, as they sat together in the library, poring over maps and documents, Roderick's hand brushed against hers, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine. He looked at her, his gray eyes meeting hers, a question in their depths. She met his gaze, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. "Emmeline," he said, his voice low and husky, the sound of her name on his lips sending a wave of warmth through her. She didn't reply, her eyes locked on his, her mind racing. She knew what he was asking, what he was offering. She knew that she should resist, that she should maintain the distance between them, that their marriage was a political arrangement, nothing more. But she couldn't. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for him, the longing that had been growing within her, the desire to feel his touch, his kiss, his embrace. She leaned towards him, her lips parting slightly, her eyes closing in anticipation. He met her halfway, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a surge of electricity through her body. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of the pent-up emotions, the fear, the uncertainty, the longing that had been building between them. They clung to each other, their bodies pressed together, their hearts pounding in unison. He pulled away, his breath ragged, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and regret. "Emmeline," he said, his voice hoarse. We should not." She placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I don't care." She kissed him again, her lips claiming his, her body molding against his, a silent declaration of her desire, her need, her surrender. They broke apart, breathing heavily, their eyes locked in a silent understanding. They had crossed a line, broken the boundaries of their carefully constructed alliance. They had entered into a dangerous territory, a realm of passion and emotion that could jeopardize everything they had been working for. There was danger, but also a certain measure of freedom. "This changes nothing," Roderick finally said, his voice raspy. Our agreement stands. Emmeline nodded, her hand still resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. And yet, she whispered, her gaze meeting his, it changes everything. She knew that their carefully constructed dance of deception had just become infinitely more complicated and more thrilling. They had to navigate the treacherous waters of the court, the queen's machinations, and now, their own growing feelings for each other. Chapter 9. The Lion's Denver. The king's return to the castle brought a shift in the atmosphere, a heightened sense of tension and anticipation. King Oberon was a formidable figure, a warrior king who had expanded the kingdom's borders through conquest and diplomacy. He was known for his strength, his ruthlessness, and his unwavering devotion to his queen. He was also known for his unpredictable temper, his swift justice, and his intolerance of any perceived disloyalty. Emmeline had met the king only a handful of times before her marriage, brief encounters during court functions, formal greetings that left her feeling intimidated and insignificant. He was a man who commanded respect, who exuded power, who seemed to see through any pretense, any deception. Roderick, as the king's enforcer, was constantly at his side, attending to his needs, carrying out his orders, advising him on matters of security and justice. Emmeline saw less of him during this time, their secret meetings curtailed, their interactions limited to brief, guarded exchanges in the public eye. She felt a growing unease, a sense of foreboding, as she observed the king's interactions with Roderick, with the queen, with the other members of the court. He seemed to be constantly watching, assessing, judging, his eyes sharp and penetrating, his expression inscrutable. One evening, Emmeline was summoned to the king's private chambers, a summons that filled her with dread. She had been expecting it, knowing that the king would eventually want to meet with her, to assess her, to determine her loyalty. But she had hoped for more time to prepare, to strengthen her defenses, to solidify her alliance with Roderick. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant gown of dark blue velvet, her hair pulled back in a severe style, her face devoid of any adornment. She wanted to project an image of strength, of composure, of unwavering loyalty. She would not show fear, she would not betray any weakness, she would not give the king any reason to doubt her. She was escorted to the king's chambers by a silent guard, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind racing. She knew that this meeting could determine her fate, that her future, her very life, hung in the balance. The king's chambers were opulent, even more so than the queen's, a display of his wealth and power. Tapestries depicting scenes of battle and conquest adorned the walls, weapons and armor were displayed in glass cases, and a large map of the kingdom dominated one wall. King Oberon sat on a raised dais, his throne a massive chair of carved oak and gold. He was a large man, powerfully built, with a thick beard and piercing blue eyes. He wore a simple but elegant tunic of dark red velvet, a gold chain of office around his neck, and a heavy sword at his side. He looked every inch the warrior king, the embodiment of strength and authority. Roderick stood beside him, his face impassive, his gaze fixed on Emmeline as she entered the room. She felt a flicker of reassurance at his presence, a sense of support, a silent acknowledgement of their alliance. Emmeline curtsied deeply, her head bowed, her voice steady as she greeted the king. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice respectful, but devoid of any fear. The king studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense, unwavering. He seemed to be assessing her, judging her, searching for any sign of weakness, of deception. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice deep and resonant, a voice that commanded attention. "You have married my most loyal knight, a man I trust above all others." "I am honored, Your Majesty," Emmeline replied, her voice still steady. "Roderick speaks highly of you," the king continued, his gaze still fixed on her. "He says you are intelligent, resourceful, and loyal." Emmeline felt a surge of relief, a lessening of the tension that had been gripping her. Roderick had spoken in her favor, he had defended her, he had protected her. "I strive to be worthy of his praise, Your Majesty," she said. The king nodded, his expression softening slightly. I understand you are from Dunmore, he said. Your brother, Lord Alaric, is a valiant warrior, but also a somewhat rebellious subject. Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine. The king was testing her, probing her loyalty, trying to gauge her reaction. My brother is loyal to the crown, your majesty, she said, her voice firm. He serves the kingdom with dedication. The king smiled, a cold, knowing smile that did not reach his eyes. Indeed, he said, but loyalty can be a fickle thing. It can be tested. It can be broken. He paused, his gaze shifting to Roderick, then back to Emmeline. I have a task for you, Lady Emmeline, he said, his voice low and purposeful. A task that will prove your loyalty. To me. To the crown. Emmeline's heart pounded, her mind racing. She knew that this was the moment, the test she had been dreading. The king was about to demand something of her, something that could jeopardize everything she had been working for, something that could betray her family, her people, her own conscience. She looked at Roderick, seeking guidance, support, a silent plea for help. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes betraying nothing of his thoughts or feelings. But she saw a flicker of warning, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a slight narrowing of his eyes. He was telling her to be careful, to be wary, to choose her words wisely. Emmeline's position was more precarious than ever. She had entered the lion's den, and the king had just bared his teeth. The task and her reaction would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise, or became another victim of courtly machinations. Chapter 10. Echoes of Treachery. The king's words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, a silent threat that sent a shiver down Emmeline's spine. She knew that this was a pivotal moment, a test of her loyalty, a challenge that could determine her fate and the fate of her family. What is it, your majesty? She asked, her voice steady, despite the turmoil within. She met the king's gaze, refusing to flinch, refusing to show any sign of fear or weakness. King Oberon leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes fixed on hers, his expression intense and unwavering. I have received reports, he said, his voice low and deliberate, of unrest in the north. Rumors of rebellion, of conspiracies against the crown. Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that the king was referring to her brother, to Alaric, and his growing discontent with the queen's policies, with the heavy taxes and the unjust decrees that were burdening Dunmore. I am aware of no such unrest, your majesty, she said, her voice carefully neutral, betraying nothing of her true knowledge or feelings. The king smiled, a cold, knowing smile that did not reach his eyes. Perhaps, he said, you are not privy to all the secrets of the north, Lady Emmeline. Perhaps your brother shields you from the harsh realities of his disloyalty. Emmeline felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment at the king's insinuation. He was trying to provoke her, to goad her into revealing something, into betraying her brother. My brother is loyal to the crown, your majesty, she repeated, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. He serves the kingdom with dedication and sacrifice. Sacrifice? The king echoed, his voice laced with sarcasm. Or ambition. Does he dream of carving out his own kingdom, Lady Emmeline? Of challenging my authority, of seizing the throne for himself? Emmeline's heart pounded against her ribs, her mind racing. She knew that she had to tread carefully, that any misstep, any hint of defiance, could be construed as treason. My brother has no such ambitions, your majesty, she said, her voice carefully controlled. He is a loyal servant of the crown, as am I. The king studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and unwavering. He seemed to be searching for any sign of deception, of weakness, of disloyalty. I want you to return to Dunmore, Lady Emmeline, he said, his voice suddenly shifting, becoming more purposeful. I want you to observe your brother, to report on his activities, to uncover any plots, any conspiracies, any threats to the crown. Emmeline felt a wave of relief, mixed with a sense of foreboding. The king was sending her home, to Dunmore, but he was also tasking her with spying on her own brother, with betraying her own family. I understand, your majesty, she said, her voice hesitant. You will be my eyes and ears in the north, Lady Emmeline, the king continued, his voice low and insistent. You will report directly to me through secure channels. You will tell me everything you see, everything you hear, everything you suspect. He paused, his gaze shifting to Roderick, then back to Emmeline. And you will be rewarded for your loyalty, Lady Emmeline. Handsomely rewarded. But you will also be punished for any disloyalty. Severely punished. The threat was clear, unmistakable. She was being given a choice, a chance to prove her loyalty, to save herself and her family. But she was also being placed in an impossible situation, forced to choose between her duty to the crown and her loyalty to her brother, to her people. She looked at Roderick, seeking guidance, support, a silent plea for help. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes betraying nothing of his thoughts or feelings. But she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of understanding, of compassion. I will do as you command, Your Majesty, she said, her voice low and submissive, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. She had made her choice, or rather, the choice had been made for her. She would return to Dunmore. She would play the part of the loyal spy. She would gather information. She would protect her brother as best she could. Excellent, the king said, his smile returning, a cold, satisfied smile. You will leave within the week. Roderick will make the necessary arrangements. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, and Emmeline curtsied deeply, her head bowed, her heart heavy with dread. She turned and left the king's chambers, Roderick following close behind. As they walked through the silent corridors, Emmeline felt a surge of despair, a sense of hopelessness. She was trapped, caught between the king's demands and her loyalty to her brother, her future uncertain, her life hanging in the balance. She knew that her actions had consequences, echoing like ripples through the still waters of the court, and beyond to the rocky borders of the north. What am I going to do? She whispered, her voice choked with emotion, turning to Roderick, her eyes pleading for help. He stopped, turning to face her, his gaze intense. You will do what you must, Emmeline, he said, his voice low and firm. You will survive. And you will protect your family. He paused, his hand reaching out to touch her arm, a gesture of comfort, of support. And I will help you. The echoes of treachery, once distant whispers, were now resonating within the castle walls. The king's task was clear, and Emmeline, with Roderick's silent pledge, was ready to face the storm brewing in the north, even if it meant walking a tightrope between loyalty and betrayal. Chapter 11. The Weight of a Crown. The journey back to Dunmore was long and arduous, a stark contrast to the opulence and comfort of the royal court. Emmeline traveled with a small retinue of guards, provided by Roderick, ostensibly for her protection, but also, she suspected, to keep an eye on her, to ensure her compliance with the king's orders. Roderick himself did not accompany her. He remained at court, bound by his duties to the king, but he had promised to send messages, to provide support, to guide her as best he could from afar. They had established a secret code, a way of communicating through seemingly innocuous letters, a way of sharing information without arousing suspicion. As they rode north, the landscape changed, becoming more rugged, more wild, the rolling hills and fertile fields giving way to towering mountains, dense forests, and windswept moors. Emmeline felt a sense of homecoming, a familiar comfort in the sight of the familiar landmarks, the scent of the pine-scented air, the sound of the rushing rivers. But she also felt a sense of trepidation, a sense of foreboding. She was returning to Dunmore not as a beloved daughter, but as a spy, a traitor in the eyes of her own brother, her own people. She was carrying the weight of the crown's expectations, the burden of the king's demands, the threat of his wrath. Dunmore Castle was a formidable fortress, perched high on a rocky crag, overlooking a vast valley. It was a symbol of strength, of resilience, of the enduring spirit of the North. It was a place of safety, of comfort, of belonging. But for Emmeline, it now felt like another prison, another gilded cage. She was greeted with warmth and affection by her family, by her brother, Alaric, by his wife, Alara, by the people of Dunmore. They welcomed her home, celebrating her return, unaware of the true purpose of her visit, of the secret mission she had been tasked with. Alaric was a tall, powerfully built man, with the same auburn hair and hazel eyes as Emmeline. He was a warrior, a leader, a man who commanded respect and loyalty. He was also a man burdened by responsibility, by the constant threat of war, by the heavy taxes and unjust decrees imposed by the Queen. He embraced Emmeline, holding her tight, his voice filled with relief and affection. "Sister," he said, "it is good to have you home. You have been missed." Emmeline felt a pang of guilt, a surge of remorse, as she returned his embrace. She was deceiving him, betraying him, playing a dangerous game that could cost him his life, his freedom, his very kingdom. "It is good to be home, Alaric," she replied, her voice carefully neutral, betraying nothing of her true feelings. Alara, Alaric's wife, was a kind and gentle woman, with a warm smile and a compassionate heart. She welcomed Emmeline with open arms, treating her like a sister, a friend, a confidant. Emmeline felt a pang of guilt, knowing that she was deceiving her, too, that she was playing a double game, a dangerous charade. The first few days at Dunmore were spent catching up, exchanging news, sharing stories. Emmeline listened carefully, observing her brother, his advisors, his men, trying to gauge their mood, their loyalty, their plans. She noticed the signs of discontent, the whispers of rebellion, the growing resentment towards the crown. She found herself torn, her loyalties divided. She loved her brother, she loved her people, she wanted to protect them from the Queen's tyranny. But she also knew that any act of defiance, any open rebellion, could lead to disaster, to bloodshed, to the destruction of Dunmore. She had to be the voice of reason, a steady hand, to prevent what seemed to be an inevitable collision. She began to send messages to Roderick, coded letters containing snippets of information, observations, warnings. She told him of the growing unrest, of Alaric's frustration, of the whispers of rebellion. She also told him of her own struggles, her own fears, her own divided loyalties. She received replies from Roderick, equally coded, offering guidance, support, reassurance. He urged her to be cautious, to be discreet, to gather as much information as possible, but to avoid taking any unnecessary risks. He reminded her of their alliance, of their shared purpose, of their growing affection. One evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, staring out at the moonlit landscape, she received a message from Roderick that sent a chill down her spine. "The falcon is circling. Be wary of the serpent's kiss." She understood the coded message immediately. The king was growing impatient. The queen was suspicious. She was in danger. Emmeline felt the weight of the crown pressing down on her, a heavy burden of responsibility, of fear, of uncertainty. She was walking a tightrope, balancing between loyalty and betrayal, between duty and love, between survival and destruction. She was being crushed by two crowns, the one Alaric was being tempted to forge, and the one that sat heavy upon King Oberon's head. She had to find a path, find a way out, find a way to save herself, her family, and her people. And she had to do it soon. Chapter 12. A Glimmer of Grace. The warning from Roderick spurred Emmeline to action. She knew she had to tread carefully, to be even more discreet in her observations and her communications. The Queen's suspicion was a dangerous thing, a venomous threat that could strike at any moment. She began to spend more time with Alaric, engaging him in conversations, subtly probing his thoughts, his plans, his intentions. She tried to gauge his loyalty to the crown, his willingness to rebel, his level of discontent. Alaric, initially overjoyed at his sister's return, grew increasingly wary of her subtle inquiries. He was not a fool. He sensed a change in Emmeline, a guardedness, a distance that had not been there before. He began to suspect that she was not being entirely truthful, that she was hiding something, that she was, perhaps, working for the Queen. One evening, as they sat together in the great hall, after the evening meal, Alaric confronted her. He dismissed the servants, the guards, the other members of the household, ensuring their privacy. Emmeline, he said, his voice low and serious, his gaze intense and unwavering. What is going on? What are you hiding? Emmeline felt a surge of panic, a sense of dread. She had been discovered, her deception revealed. She knew that she had to be careful, that any misstep, any lie, could have dire consequences. I don't know what you mean, Alaric, she said, her voice hesitant, trying to maintain a facade of innocence. Alaric scoffed, his eyes narrowing, his expression hardening. Don't play games with me, sister, he said, his voice laced with anger. I know you are hiding something. I can see it in your eyes, in your manner, in your questions. He paused, his gaze searching hers. Are you working for the Queen, Emmeline? Are you spying on me? Emmeline felt a lump in her throat, a tightness in her chest. She was trapped, cornered, with no escape. She could deny it, she could lie, but she knew that Alaric would not believe her. He knew her too well, he could see through her deception. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, preparing to confess, to reveal the truth, to face the consequences. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper, the word tasting like ashes in her mouth. I am. Alaric stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief, of betrayal, of hurt. He had trusted her, loved her, welcomed her home. And she had deceived him, betrayed him, spied on him. Why, Emmeline? He asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Why would you do this? Why would you betray your own brother, your own family, your own people? Emmeline felt tears welling up in her eyes, tears of shame, of guilt, of remorse. She had hurt him, wounded him deeply, broken his trust. I had no choice, Alaric, she said, her voice choked with emotion. The king, he threatened me. He threatened Dunmore. He threatened you. She explained everything, recounting the events at court, the accusation of treason, the forced marriage to Roderick, the king's demands, the threat to her family, to her people. She told him of her alliance with Roderick, of their secret communications, of their efforts to protect Dunmore, to navigate the treacherous waters of the royal court. Alaric listened in silence, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief to understanding. He saw the pain in her eyes, the sincerity in her voice, the desperation in her plea. So, you are a spy for the king, he said, his tone changing, but also for Dunmore itself. And Roderick, he is complicit? Yes, Emmeline confirmed. And your marriage? Alaric inquired, the rawness of his voice evident. Emmeline hesitated. How to explain the growing affection, the unexpected bond? A tool, she finally answered. But a tool that has become more. Alaric nodded, absorbing the complexities of her situation. He, too, had made difficult choices, had walked a tightrope between duty and rebellion. He understood the burdens she carried, the weight of the crown's expectations. He stood and went to the large window, staring into the darkness of the bailey below. You are walking on very sharp daggers, Emmeline. I know, she said. But what choice do I have? What choice do we have? He turned around, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Perhaps, he said, his voice low and thoughtful, we can turn this to our advantage. Perhaps we can use your position to influence the king, to negotiate a better outcome for Dunmore. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. Perhaps we can work together, Emmeline. You, me, and Roderick. A united front, a force to be reckoned with. Emmeline felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of grace in the darkness. Her brother was not condemning her, not rejecting her. He was offering her a partnership, an alliance, a chance to redeem herself, to protect her family, to save Dunmore. It was a fragile hope, a slender thread of possibility in a tapestry of treachery and deceit. But it was something. It was a start. It was a chance to turn the tables, to play the game on her own terms, to fight for a better future. The serpent's kiss had been averted, for now, and a new path fraught with peril, yet offering a sliver of redemption, had unexpectedly opened before her. Chapter 13. Trials by Fire. The alliance between Emmeline, Alaric, and Roderick was a fragile one, built on a foundation of shared secrets, mutual trust, and a desperate hope for a better future. They communicated through coded messages, carefully crafted letters that passed between Dunmore and the royal court, sharing information, coordinating their strategies, navigating the treacherous waters of their situation. Emmeline, now acting as a double agent, continued to provide information to the king, feeding him carefully selected details, snippets of truth mixed with subtle misdirection, enough to satisfy his suspicions, but not enough to reveal the full extent of Alaric's plans or her own growing defiance. Roderick, using his position as the king's enforcer, continued to shield Emmeline, deflecting suspicion, intercepting messages, providing her with warnings and guidance. He also began to subtly influence the king, planting seeds of doubt, suggesting alternative solutions, subtly steering him away from the more drastic measures advocated by the queen. Alaric, emboldened by the alliance, began to consolidate his power in the north, strengthening his defenses, forging alliances with other discontented lords, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the crown, while simultaneously working with Emmeline to appear compliant. The queen, however, remained a constant threat, a venomous serpent lurking in the shadows, her suspicions growing, her desire for control insatiable. She saw Emmeline as a rival, a threat to her power, a pawn that was not entirely under her control. She began to plot against her, seeking ways to discredit her, to expose her, to eliminate her. The first test of their alliance came in the form of a royal decree, a new tax imposed on the northern lords, a blatant attempt by the queen to further impoverish Dunmore, to weaken Alaric's position, to provoke him into open rebellion. Emmeline received a coded message from Roderick, warning her of the impending decree, giving her time to prepare, to strategize, to find a way to mitigate the damage. She met with Alaric, sharing the information, discussing their options. They knew that they could not openly defy the decree, that any act of rebellion would be met with swift and brutal force. But they also knew that they could not simply comply, that the new tax would cripple Dunmore, leaving their people starving and vulnerable. They decided on a course of action, a carefully calculated plan of passive resistance, a strategy of subtle defiance that would, hopefully, buy them time, allow them to negotiate a better outcome, without provoking the king's wrath. Alaric sent a formal protest to the king, expressing his concerns about the new tax, highlighting the hardship it would cause, pleading for leniency. He also instructed his people to delay payment, to find ways to avoid the tax collectors, to subtly undermine the implementation of the decree. Emmeline, using her position as Roderick's wife, subtly reinforced Alaric's message, speaking to the king, appealing to his sense of justice, his concern for his people, subtly suggesting that the queen's advisors might be misleading him, that the new tax might be counterproductive. Roderick, working behind the scenes, provided the king with alternative sources of revenue, suggesting other ways to raise funds, subtly undermining the queen's influence, creating a space for negotiation. Their efforts were partially successful. The king, influenced by Roderick and swayed by Emmeline's pleas, agreed to delay the implementation of the new tax, to reconsider its impact, to negotiate with Alaric. It was a small victory, a temporary reprieve, but it was a sign that their alliance was working, that their combined efforts could make a difference. The second test came in the form of a royal visit. The queen, growing increasingly suspicious of Emmeline and Alaric, decided to visit Dunmore herself, ostensibly to assess the situation, to ensure compliance with the royal decrees, but in reality, to expose their treachery, to eliminate her rivals. Emmeline received another warning from Roderick, a coded message that sent a chill down her spine. The serpent is coming. Prepare your defenses. She knew that the queen's visit was a trap, a dangerous game of cat and mouse, a trial by fire that could determine their fate. She had to be prepared. She had to be vigilant. She had to protect herself, her brother, her people. She met with Alaric, sharing the warning, preparing their defenses, coordinating their strategy. They would play the part of the loyal subjects, welcoming the queen with open arms, showering her with hospitality, concealing their true feelings, their true intentions. But beneath the surface, they would be watching her, observing her every move, listening to her every word, searching for any clue to her plans, any opportunity to counter her machinations. The queen arrived at Dunmore with a large retinue of guards, advisors, and courtiers, a display of power and authority designed to intimidate and overawe. She was dressed in a magnificent gown of crimson velvet, her golden hair adorned with jewels, her sapphire eyes sharp and penetrating, her smile cold and insincere. Emmeline and Alaric greeted her with formal courtesy, bowing low, offering their hospitality, playing the part of the dutiful subjects. But their hearts were pounding, their minds racing, their senses on high alert. The queen's visit was a tense and dangerous affair, a constant test of wills, a subtle battle of wits. She questioned Emmeline, probed her loyalty, tested her knowledge, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of treachery. She observed Alaric, scrutinizing his actions, his words, his demeanor, looking for any indication of rebellion, of defiance. But Emmeline and Alaric were prepared. They had anticipated her questions, rehearsed their answers, concealed their true feelings, their true intentions. They played the game. They danced the dance of deception. They survived. The trials by fire were far from over, but they had passed the first crucial tests. The alliance held, the deception continued, and the glimmer of hope, though fragile, remained alive. The serpent had been held at bay, but its venomous threat still lingered, a constant reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. Chapter 14. The Heart's Reckoning. The Queen's visit, though fraught with tension and danger, had an unexpected consequence. It brought Emmeline and Roderick closer, albeit through the clandestine exchange of coded messages. The shared threat, the constant vigilance, the need for absolute trust, forged a deeper bond between them, a connection that transcended the political machinations and the forced nature of their marriage. Roderick's messages became more than just warnings and guidance. They became expressions of concern, of affection, of a growing longing for her presence. He wrote of his loneliness at court, of his frustration with the king's blindness to the queen's manipulations, of his admiration for Emmeline's courage and resilience. Emmeline, in turn, found herself pouring her heart out to him in her replies, sharing her fears, her doubts, her hopes, her growing feelings for him. She wrote of her love for Dunmore, of her loyalty to her brother, of her desire for a better future, a future where she could be free, where she could be with him. Their letters became their sanctuary, a space where they could be honest, vulnerable, where they could express their true feelings without fear of judgment or reprisal. They were falling in love, not in the grand, romantic way of courtly ballads, but in a quiet, profound way, forged in the crucible of shared adversity, mutual respect, and a growing understanding of each other's hearts. One particular message from Roderick sent a wave of warmth through Emmeline, a feeling that she had not allowed herself to acknowledge, to embrace, until now. My heart aches for you, Emmeline. I long for the day when this darkness ends, when we can be together, free from the shadows, free from the lies, free from the crown. She read the words over and over, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed, her body trembling with a mixture of longing and fear. She was falling in love with her husband, the man she had been forced to marry, the man who had become her ally, her protector, her confidant. But she also knew that their love was forbidden, dangerous, a threat to everything they had been working for. The Queen would never allow it, the King would never condone it, the court would never accept it. Their love was a fragile flower, blooming in the darkness, a secret that had to be guarded, protected, hidden from the world. She replied to his message, her words pouring out of her, a confession of her own feelings, her own desires, her own fears. My heart echoes yours, Roderick. I, too, long for that day, but I fear it may never come. We are trapped, bound by duty, by circumstance, by the weight of the crown. Their exchange of letters became more frequent, more intimate, a lifeline connecting them across the distance, a testament to their growing love, their shared hope for a future that seemed increasingly impossible. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Emmeline's role as a double agent became increasingly difficult, the strain of maintaining the deception, of balancing her loyalty to her brother and her duty to the crown, taking its toll. She felt torn, divided, her heart aching for Roderick, her mind consumed by the constant threat of discovery, of betrayal, of destruction. She knew that she could not continue this charade indefinitely, that sooner or later she would have to make a choice, a decision that would determine her fate, the fate of her family, the fate of Dunmore. She confided in Alaric, sharing her feelings for Roderick, her fears about the future, her growing despair. Alaric, having witnessed Emmeline's transformation and having received his own coded messages from Roderick, a cautious, yet respectful correspondence between the two men, listened with understanding and compassion. "You love him," Alaric said, his voice soft, his gaze filled with empathy. Emmeline nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "I do. And he loves you," Alaric continued. "I can see it in his letters, in his actions, in the way he protects you. But what can we do?" Emmeline asked, her voice choked with emotion. "We are trapped, Alaric. There is no way out." Alaric was silent for a long moment, his mind working, considering their options, weighing the risks. "There is always a way, Emmeline," he said, his voice firm, his gaze resolute. "We may have to fight for it, we may have to risk everything, but there is always a way." He paused, his hand reaching out to touch her arm, a gesture of support, of solidarity. "We will find a way, Emmeline. Together. You, me, and Roderick. We will break free from this darkness. We will forge our own destiny." His words, spoken with such conviction, such determination, gave Emmeline a renewed sense of hope, a flicker of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. She was not alone. She had her brother. She had Roderick. She had their alliance, their love, their shared determination to fight for a better future. The heart's reckoning was upon them, a time for difficult choices, for courageous actions, for a final, desperate gamble to break free from the chains of duty, of deception, of the crown. The reckoning was coming, and it would involve the very fabric of their lives. Love, loyalty, and freedom hung precariously in the balance, and the scales were about to be tipped. Chapter 15. Beyond the Walls. The catalyst came in the form of a summons. A royal decree, delivered by a grim-faced messenger, demanding Alaric's presence at court. The king, ostensibly, wished to discuss the ongoing negotiations regarding the northern taxes, to address Alaric's concerns, to find a peaceful resolution. But Emmeline and Alaric knew better. It was a trap. The queen's influence had grown stronger, her suspicions had hardened, her desire for revenge had become insatiable. She had convinced the king that Alaric was a threat, a rebel, a traitor who needed to be eliminated. The summons was a lure, a way to draw Alaric into the lion's den, to isolate him, to imprison him, to execute him. Emmeline received a frantic message from Roderick, confirming their fears, warning them of the danger. "The serpent has struck. Do not go to court. It is a trap." She showed the message to Alaric, her heart pounding, her mind racing. They knew that they could not comply with the summons, that any attempt to negotiate, to appease the king, would be futile. But they also knew that they could not simply refuse, that any open defiance would be met with swift and brutal force. They were trapped, cornered, with no escape. Or were they? An idea, a desperate gamble, a flicker of hope in the darkness, began to form in Emmeline's mind. It was a risky plan, a dangerous maneuver, a move that could either save them or destroy them. But it was their only chance. "We will go to court," she said, her voice firm, her gaze resolute. But not in the way they expect. Alaric looked at her, his eyebrows raised, his expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "What do you mean?" "We will use the summons to our advantage," Emmeline explained. "We will expose the queen's treachery. We will reveal her lies. We will turn the tables on her." She outlined her plan, a daring scheme that involved a secret journey, a hidden message, a carefully orchestrated confrontation. It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble, but it was their only hope. Alaric listened intently, his mind working, assessing the risks, weighing the possibilities. He was a warrior, a leader, a man who was not afraid to take risks, to fight for what he believed in. "It is a bold plan, Emmeline," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "But it could work. It just might work." They spent the next few days preparing, gathering evidence, coordinating their strategy, making arrangements for their secret journey. They knew that they were walking into a trap, that they were risking everything, but they were determined to fight, to expose the Queen, to save themselves, to secure a future for Dunmore. Emmeline sent a message to Roderick, informing him of their plan, asking for his help, his support, his guidance. "We are coming to court, but not as prisoners. We are coming as accusers. Prepare the ground. We will need your help." Roderick's reply was swift and succinct. "I will be ready. Godspeed." With their plan in place, Emmeline and Alaric, accompanied by a small, trusted band of loyal men, set off on their secret journey to the royal court. They traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads, using hidden paths, disguising themselves as simple travelers, merchants, pilgrims. They left behind the familiar comfort of Dunmore, the safety of their home, the protection of their people. They were venturing beyond the walls, into the heart of the enemy's territory, into the lion's den. Their journey was fraught with peril, with constant threats of discovery, of capture, of betrayal. But they pressed on, driven by their determination, their courage, their hope for a better future. They were fighting for their lives, for their freedom, for their love. As they approached the royal court, Emmeline felt a surge of fear, a sense of dread. But she also felt a surge of determination, a sense of purpose. She was not a pawn anymore. She was a player, a warrior, a woman fighting for her destiny. She was ready to confront the Queen, to expose her lies, to reveal her treachery. She was ready to face the king, to plead her case, to demand justice. She was ready to fight for her love, for Roderick, for the future they both dreamed of. They had ventured beyond the walls, both literally and figuratively. Their future rested on the success of this gamble. The fate of Dunmore, the lives of those they loved, and the promise of a life together, free from the shadows, all hung precariously in the balance. Chapter 16. A Knight's Confession. Emmeline and Alaric arrived at the royal court under the cloak of a moonless night, their small band disguised as traveling merchants seeking an audience with the king regarding trade tariffs a plausible, if somewhat flimsy, cover story. They were ushered into the castle, not through the grand, ceremonial entrance, but through a side gate, used for deliveries and less distinguished visitors. It was a subtle humiliation, a reminder of their precarious position, but it also served their purpose, allowing them to enter undetected, unannounced. Roderick was waiting for them in a dimly lit antechamber, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He embraced Emmeline, holding her tight, his touch conveying a silent message of love, of support, of shared danger. "You are here," he said, his voice low and husky, his breath warm against her ear. "You are safe. For now," Emmeline replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But the Queen she suspects," Roderick interrupted, his gaze shifting to Alaric, offering him a curt nod of acknowledgement. "She has been influencing the king. He is unstable, unpredictable. We have to act quickly," Alaric said, his voice firm, his gaze resolute. "We have to expose her before she can silence us." Roderick nodded. "I have prepared the ground," he said. "I have planted seeds of doubt. I have gathered allies. But it will be difficult, dangerous." He explained his plan, a carefully orchestrated maneuver to expose the Queen's treachery during a public audience with the king, a gathering of the court, a forum where her lies could be revealed, her crimes exposed. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. Emmeline and Alaric listened intently, their minds racing, absorbing the details, preparing themselves for the confrontation. They knew that they were walking into a trap, that they were risking everything, but they were determined to fight, to expose the Queen, to save themselves, to secure a future for Dunmore. The following morning, Emmeline and Alaric, dressed in simple but elegant attire, were summoned to the great hall, where the king was holding court. The hall was filled with courtiers, nobles, advisors, guards, a sea of faces, a tapestry of power and intrigue. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with the unspoken knowledge that something momentous was about to happen. The queen sat beside the king, her smile bright and insincere, her eyes sharp and penetrating, her gaze constantly scanning the room, assessing, calculating. She looked confident, assured, convinced of her victory. She believed she had trapped Alaric, that she was about to expose him as a traitor, to eliminate him, to consolidate her power. Emmeline and Alaric stood before the king, their heads held high, their expressions calm and composed, concealing the turmoil within. They played the part of the humble petitioners, the loyal subjects seeking an audience with their sovereign. The king, his face a mask of stern authority, his eyes clouded with suspicion, addressed them. "You have requested an audience, Lord Alaric," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "You have concerns about the northern taxes." Alaric stepped forward, bowing low, his voice respectful but firm. "Your Majesty," he said, "I have come to address a more serious matter. A matter that concerns the security of the kingdom, the integrity of the crown." He paused, his gaze shifting to the queen, then back to the king. "I have come to expose a traitor, Your Majesty. A traitor who sits beside you, who whispers lies in your ear, who plots against your rule." A gasp rippled through the hall, a collective intake of breath, a wave of shock and disbelief. The queen's smile vanished, replaced by a look of outrage, of fury, of fear. "What is the meaning of this?" the king demanded, his voice rising, his face turning red with anger. "You dare to accuse the queen?" "I do, Your Majesty," Alaric replied, his voice unwavering. "And I have proof." He presented the evidence, the coded messages intercepted by Roderick, the testimonies of witnesses, the accounts of the queen's machinations, her plots, her lies, her attempts to undermine the king's authority, to seize power for herself. The hall was silent, stunned, as the evidence was presented, as the truth was revealed, as the queen's treachery was exposed. The courtiers, the nobles, the advisors, all stared at the queen, their faces filled with shock, with disbelief, with disgust. The king, his face pale, his hands trembling, listened in stunned silence. He looked at the queen, his eyes filled with confusion, with betrayal, with rage. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice shaking with emotion. "Have you deceived me? Have you betrayed me?" The queen, her composure shattered, her mask of innocence ripped away, tried to deny the accusations, to defend herself, to deflect the blame. But her words were hollow, her lies exposed, her treachery revealed. Roderick stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative, confirming the evidence, corroborating Alaric's accusations, providing further details of the queen's crimes. He spoke with the conviction of a knight, with the authority of the king's enforcer, with the passion of a man defending his love, his honor, his future. In a single, tearful confession, Roderick admitted that he had married Emmeline under duress, and to safeguard the realm, he had agreed. He confessed his love for her as well. "I did it for duty," Roderick's voice echoed through the hall. "But I stay with her for love, and I will protect her and the realm from any who threaten either." It was a knight's confession, a declaration of love and loyalty, a turning point in the drama that was unfolding. The king, swayed by the evidence, convinced by Roderick's testimony, finally saw the truth, the extent of the queen's deception, the depth of her betrayal. He rose from his throne, his face contorted with fury, his voice booming through the hall. "Guards!" he roared. "Seize her!" The queen was arrested, dragged away screaming and protesting, her reign of terror brought to an abrupt and ignominious end. The lion's den had become her prison. The tables had been turned. The accusers had become the victors. And a knight's confession had saved them all. Chapter 17. The Queen's Gambit. The arrest of Queen Isolde sent shockwaves through the royal court, a seismic shift in the balance of power. The courtiers, who had once flocked to her side, now distanced themselves, their loyalty as fickle as the wind. The advisers, who had once whispered lies in the king's ear, now scrambled to proclaim their innocence, their ignorance of the queen's treachery. The king, reeling from the betrayal, shaken by the revelation of his wife's crimes, retreated into a state of stunned silence, his authority diminished, his confidence shattered. He relied heavily on Roderick, his trusted enforcer, to maintain order, to investigate the queen's conspiracy, to ensure the stability of the kingdom. Emmeline and Alaric, their names cleared, their loyalty vindicated, were welcomed back into the king's favor, their positions restored, their reputations enhanced. They had risked everything, and they had won. But their victory was bittersweet, shadowed by the knowledge of the queen's betrayal, by the fragility of their position, by the uncertainty of the future. The immediate aftermath of the queen's arrest was a period of intense activity, of investigations, of interrogations, of trials. The queen's co-conspirators were rounded up, their plots exposed, their crimes punished. The court was purged of its corrupt elements. The kingdom slowly began to heal from the wounds inflicted by the queen's reign of terror. Emmeline, using her newfound influence, worked tirelessly to secure a better future for Dunmore, to negotiate a fairer deal for the northern lords, to ensure the peace and prosperity of her people. She worked closely with Roderick, their alliance strengthened by their shared victory, their love deepened by their shared ordeal. Roderick, freed from the shackles of his forced marriage, his name cleared, his honor restored, was finally able to publicly acknowledge his love for Emmeline. He asked the king for permission to formally wed her, to make their union a true marriage, a bond of love, not of duty. The king, grateful for Roderick's loyalty, humbled by his own blindness, readily agreed. He granted their request, bestowing his blessing upon their union, offering them a chance to build a future together, free from the shadows, free from the lies, free from the crown's oppressive weight. But the queen, even in captivity, remained a threat. She was imprisoned in the castle's highest tower, stripped of her title, her power, her influence. But she was not defeated. She was plotting, scheming, seeking a way to escape, to regain her power, to exact revenge on those who had brought her down. She had one final gambit, a desperate play, a last-ditch attempt to turn the tables, to reclaim her throne, to destroy her enemies. She had a secret weapon, a hidden ally, a loyal servant who had remained undetected, unsuspected, a pawn that she was about to sacrifice. The servant was a young woman, a seemingly insignificant member of the castle staff, a maid who had served the queen for years, quietly, discreetly, invisibly. She was devoted to the queen, blindly loyal, willing to do anything for her mistress, even to sacrifice her own life. The queen, using her cunning, her manipulative skills, had managed to smuggle a message to the maid, a desperate plea for help, a detailed plan for escape, a final, deadly act of revenge. The maid, following the queen's instructions, began to put the plan into motion. She gathered supplies, she made contacts, she prepared the ground for the queen's escape. She was careful, discreet, invisible, moving through the castle like a ghost, unnoticed, unsuspected. One evening, as Emmeline and Roderick were celebrating their impending wedding with a small, private gathering of close friends and family, the maid struck. She poisoned the wine, a potent, deadly concoction that would kill quickly, silently, leaving no trace. The poisoned wine was served to Emmeline, a toast to her happiness, a celebration of her future, a final, deadly kiss from the queen. Emmeline, unsuspecting, took a sip of the wine, her heart filled with joy, with love, with hope. She looked at Roderick, her eyes sparkling, her smile radiant, her future stretching out before her, bright and promising. But then, she felt a sharp pain, a burning sensation in her throat, a sudden dizziness, a terrifying weakness. She gasped, clutching her chest, her eyes widening in horror, her body collapsing. Roderick caught her as she fell, his face filled with alarm, with disbelief, with a growing, agonizing fear. He shouted for help, his voice echoing through the chamber, his heart pounding, his mind racing. "Emmeline!" he cried, his voice choked with emotion. "What is happening? What is wrong?" Emmeline, struggling to breathe, her body racked with pain, looked at him, her eyes filled with love, with regret, with a silent farewell. "The wine," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand reaching out to touch his face, a final, desperate gesture of love. Poison the Queen's gambit, her final, desperate play, had seemingly succeeded. Emmeline lay dying in Roderick's arms, her life slipping away, her future stolen, her love betrayed. The celebration had turned into a tragedy, the joy into despair, the hope into ashes. The game was not over, and a queen, even dethroned, still had the power to strike a devastating blow. Chapter 18. Seeds of Rebellion. The scene in the chamber was one of chaos and despair. Roderick, cradling Emmeline's limp body, shouted for help, his voice raw with anguish and terror. Guests scattered, some rushing to assist, others frozen in shock and horror. The festive atmosphere had been shattered, replaced by a chilling pall of fear and grief. Physicians were summoned, rushing to Emmeline's side, examining her, administering antidotes, desperately trying to counteract the effects of the poison. But their efforts seemed futile, her condition deteriorating rapidly, her breathing shallow and labored, her pulse weak and erratic. Roderick, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and rage, knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering words of love, of comfort, of desperate hope. He refused to leave her side, his presence a beacon of strength and unwavering devotion in the midst of the chaos. Alaric, his face a mask of fury and grief, immediately suspected the Queen's hand in this, his suspicions quickly confirmed by the discovery of the poisoned wine bottle and the subsequent confession of the terrified, remorseful maid. She revealed the Queen's plot, her instructions, her desperate attempt to escape and exact revenge. The maid was taken into custody, the Queen's final gambit exposed, her last pawn sacrificed. But the damage had been done. Emmeline lay on the brink of death, her life hanging by a thread. Roderick, fueled by a desperate rage and a burning desire for justice, stormed to the Queen's Tower prison, his sword drawn, his heart filled with vengeance. He confronted her, accusing her of the attempted murder, his voice shaking with fury and grief. The Queen, her face a mask of defiance and hatred, did not deny her involvement. She gloated over her near success, taunting Roderick, reveling in his pain, her eyes filled with a cold, malicious triumph. "She will die," the Queen hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "And you will be left with nothing. Nothing but your grief and your regret." Roderick, his control snapping, raised his sword, ready to strike her down, to end her reign of terror once and for all. But then, he hesitated, his hand trembling, his conscience battling with his rage. He was a knight, bound by a code of honor, a man of justice, not a murderer. He could not kill a defenseless woman, even one as evil as the Queen. He lowered his sword, his body shaking with the effort of restraining his fury. "You will be punished," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You will pay for your crimes. But not by my hand." He left the Queen's Tower, his heart heavy with grief and anger, returning to Emmeline's side, his hope dwindling, his despair growing. The physicians, after hours of desperate effort, managed to stabilize Emmeline's condition, the antidote finally taking effect, the poison slowly losing its grip. But she remained unconscious, her life still in danger, her future uncertain. Roderick sat beside her bed, holding her hand, watching over her, praying for her recovery. He spoke to her, whispering words of love, of encouragement, of hope, his voice choked with emotion, his tears falling on her pale cheeks. As the night wore on, and the first rays of dawn began to filter through the window, Emmeline stirred. She opened her eyes, her gaze weak and unfocused, her body trembling with exhaustion. Roderick, seeing her awake, felt a surge of relief, a wave of overwhelming joy and gratitude. He leaned down, kissing her forehead, his tears mixing with hers. "Emmeline," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You are alive. You are safe. Emmeline, her memory hazy, her mind still clouded by the effects of the poison, looked at him, her eyes slowly focusing, recognition dawning in their depths. "Roderick," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. What happened?" He explained everything, recounting the events of the evening, the Queen's plot, the poisoned wine, the desperate efforts to save her. Emmeline, listening to his words, felt a wave of horror, of revulsion, of gratitude. She had been so close to death, her life almost stolen from her by the Queen's venomous hatred. But she had survived. She was alive. And she was with Roderick. The near-death experience, the brush with mortality, had a profound effect on Emmeline and Roderick. It strengthened their bond, deepened their love, clarified their priorities. They had faced death, and they had survived. And they were determined to live, to love, to build a future together, free from the shadows, free from the threats, free from the crown's oppressive weight. But the Queen's final act of treachery had also ignited something else, something dangerous, something powerful. Seeds of rebellion, long dormant, began to sprout in the hearts of the northern lords, fueled by the injustice, the cruelty, the tyranny of the crown. Alaric, witnessing his sister's near death, his people's suffering, his own frustration and anger boiling over, began to seriously consider a course of action that he had long resisted, a path that could lead to war, to bloodshed, to the overthrow of the king. The near tragedy had planted a dangerous idea, and it was rapidly taking root. Chapter 19. The Dawn of Battle. The attempt on Emmeline's life served as the final spark, igniting the smoldering embers of rebellion in the north. Alaric, his patience exhausted, his loyalty shattered, his heart filled with a burning desire for justice and freedom, began to openly defy the crown, calling upon the northern lords to join him in a fight for independence, for a future free from the king's tyranny. Many of the northern lords, long resentful of the crown's heavy taxes, unjust decrees, and the Queen's cruel manipulations, answered his call, pledging their support, their men, their resources to the cause of rebellion. They had witnessed the king's weakness, the Queen's treachery, the near death of Emmeline, and they had had enough. Alaric, with the support of the northern lords, began to assemble an army, preparing for war, fortifying Dunmore, sending messages to potential allies in other parts of the kingdom, seeking to build a coalition strong enough to challenge the king's authority. Emmeline, though still weak and recovering from the effects of the poison, supported Alaric's decision, her own loyalty to the crown shattered by the Queen's actions, her heart filled with a fierce determination to protect her family, her people, her future. She used her knowledge of the court, her contacts, her influence to aid the rebellion, providing Alaric with valuable information, strategic advice, and unwavering moral support. Roderick, torn between his loyalty to the king and his love for Emmeline, found himself in an impossible situation. He understood Alaric's grievances. He sympathized with the northern lord's desire for freedom. He shared Emmeline's outrage at the Queen's actions. But he was also a knight, sworn to serve the king, bound by a code of honor, a man of duty. He tried to mediate, to find a peaceful solution, to negotiate a compromise between the king and Alaric, to prevent the kingdom from plunging into a bloody civil war. But his efforts were futile. The king, still reeling from the Queen's betrayal, his judgment clouded by grief and anger, refused to listen, his pride wounded, his authority challenged. He saw Alaric's actions as treason, his demands as unacceptable, his rebellion as a threat that had to be crushed. Roderick, realizing that war was inevitable, faced a heart-wrenching choice. He could remain loyal to the king, fighting against Emmeline and Alaric, betraying his love, his conscience, his own sense of justice. Or he could join the rebellion, fighting against the king, breaking his oath, risking his life, his honor, his future. He chose love. He chose justice. He chose freedom. He resigned his position as the king's enforcer, renouncing his oath, breaking his ties to the crown, joining Emmeline and Alaric in their fight for independence. It was a decision that cost him dearly, a sacrifice that weighed heavily on his heart, but it was a decision that he knew was right, a choice that he could live with, a stand that he could defend. The news of Roderick's defection sent shockwaves through the royal court, a devastating blow to the king's morale, a significant boost to the rebellion's strength. He was a respected knight, a skilled warrior, a brilliant strategist, a man of honor and integrity. His decision to join the rebellion lent legitimacy to their cause, inspiring others to join their ranks, weakening the king's support. The kingdom was now divided, plunged into a state of civil war, the north against the south, Alaric against the king, brother against brother, friend against friend. The dawn of battle had arrived, a bloody and brutal conflict that would determine the fate of the kingdom, the future of its people, the destiny of Emmeline and Roderick. Emmeline, standing beside Roderick and Alaric, watching as their army prepared for war, felt a mixture of fear and determination. She was afraid of the bloodshed, the violence, the loss of life that was about to unfold. But she was also determined to fight, to protect her family, her people, her love. She had chosen her side, she had made her stand, and she would not waver. As the banners of Dunmore were raised, and the drums of war began to beat, a new era was ushered in. It was an era of conflict, of uncertainty, but also of hope. The hope for a better future, a future free from tyranny, a future where love and justice could prevail. The price would be high, but the cause was just, and they were ready to pay that price. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The war between the North and the South was brutal and protracted, a bloody conflict that ravaged the kingdom, testing the loyalties and courage of all involved. Battles were fought, castles were besieged, lives were lost, and the land was stained with the blood of patriots and loyalists alike. Alaric, leading the northern forces, proved to be a skilled and courageous commander, his determination fueled by his love for his people and his desire for freedom. He fought with a fierce intensity, inspiring his men, winning key victories, pushing back the king's forces. Roderick, fighting alongside Alaric, his military expertise and strategic brilliance proving invaluable, played a crucial role in the rebellion's success. He fought with the skill of a seasoned warrior, the courage of a knight, and the passion of a man fighting for his love, his future, his beliefs. Emmeline, though not a warrior, played her own vital role in the conflict. She remained at Dunmore, organizing supplies, tending to the wounded, bolstering morale, providing counsel to Alaric, and maintaining secret communications with their allies in other parts of the kingdom. She was the heart of the rebellion, the symbol of hope, the unwavering spirit that kept their cause alive. The war dragged on, months turning into years, the outcome uncertain, the cost in lives and suffering mounting. Both sides suffered heavy losses, both sides experienced victories and defeats, and the kingdom was torn apart by the conflict. The final battle took place on the fields before the royal capital, a massive clash of armies, a decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom. The northern forces, led by Alaric and Roderick, faced the king's army, a larger, better-equipped force, but one weakened by internal divisions, low morale, and the king's increasingly erratic leadership. The battle raged for hours, a brutal and bloody affair, the outcome hanging in the balance. Men fought and died, courage and skill clashing with desperation and fear. The field was strewn with the bodies of the fallen, the air filled with the cries of the wounded, the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves. Roderick, fighting in the thick of the battle, his sword flashing, his armor stained with blood, found himself face to face with the king. The two men, once allies, once friends, now enemies, locked in a deadly duel, a final reckoning of love and duty. The king, his face contorted with rage and despair, fought with a desperate ferocity, his strength fueled by his wounded pride, his shattered authority, his lost love. But Roderick, fighting with the skill of a seasoned warrior, the courage of a knight, and the passion of a man fighting for his future, proved to be the stronger, the more skilled, the more determined. He disarmed the king, his sword point at his throat, his eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. He had defeated his former sovereign, the man he had once sworn to serve, the man he had once respected. "It is over," Roderick said, his voice low and firm. "Surrender." The king, his spirit broken, his body exhausted, his reign at an end, lowered his head in defeat. He had lost. The rebellion had won. The battle ended, the fighting ceased, the silence of the aftermath descending upon the blood-soaked field. The northern forces had triumphed. The king had been defeated. The war was over. Alaric, victorious but weary, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow, rode to Roderick's side, embracing him, thanking him for his courage, his loyalty, his sacrifice. "We have won, Roderick," Alaric said, his voice choked with emotion. "We are free." Roderick nodded, his gaze shifting to the distant towers of the royal castle, his thoughts on Emmeline, his heart filled with longing for her, with hope for their future. The king was taken prisoner, his reign ended, his legacy tarnished. The queen, still imprisoned in her tower, was brought to trial, her crimes exposed, her sentence pronounced. She was stripped of her title, her lands, her life. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. The kingdom, ravaged by war, began the long and arduous process of healing, of rebuilding, of reconciliation. Alaric, recognized as the rightful ruler of the North, established a new order, a fairer, more just society, based on the principles of freedom, equality, and respect for the rights of all. Emmeline and Roderick, their love tested by fire, their bond strengthened by adversity, were finally able to be together, free from the shadows, free from the threats, free from the crown's oppressive weight. They were married in a simple ceremony at Dunmore, surrounded by their family and friends, their love a beacon of hope, a symbol of a new beginning, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Their reckoning had come, love and duty had found their balance, and a new era had begun. Epilogue. Years passed, and the scars of war slowly faded, replaced by the gentle balm of peace and prosperity. Dunmore flourished under Alaric's wise and just rule, its people thriving, its borders secure, its future bright. The North and the South, once divided by conflict, were slowly reunited, bound together by a shared desire for a better future, a future free from tyranny and oppression. Emmeline and Roderick, living at Dunmore, built a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joys of family. They had children, strong sons and beautiful daughters, who grew up in a world free from the shadows of the past, a world where their parents' courage and sacrifice were celebrated, their love story a legend whispered in the halls of the castle. Roderick, though no longer a knight of the crown, remained a warrior at heart, a protector of his family, his people, his land. He served Alaric as a trusted advisor, a loyal friend, a steadfast ally, his wisdom and experience invaluable in guiding the North through the challenges of peace and reconstruction. Emmeline, her strength and resilience undiminished by the trials she had endured, became a symbol of hope and inspiration for her people. She devoted herself to the welfare of Dunmore, establishing schools, hospitals, and charities, working tirelessly to improve the lives of those around her. She was a beloved figure, a respected leader, a woman who had faced adversity with courage and grace, and who had emerged victorious. Their love story became a legend, a tale told and retold throughout the kingdom, a testament to the enduring power of love, loyalty, and the human spirit. They had faced betrayal, treachery, war, and death, and they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable, their love a beacon of hope in a world often filled with darkness. One evening, as they sat together on the battlements of Dunmore Castle, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant hues of orange, purple, and gold, Roderick took Emmeline's hand, his touch gentle, his gaze filled with love and gratitude. "We have come a long way, my love," he said, his voice soft, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Emmeline nodded, her heart filled with a deep and abiding peace. "We have," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "And we have done it together." They looked out at the landscape, at the rolling hills, the dense forests, the distant mountains, the land they had fought for, the land they loved, the land where they had built their life, their family, their future. The wind whispered through the battlements, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, the sound of birdsong and distant laughter. It was a peaceful evening, a serene moment, a testament to the enduring power of love, loyalty, and the human spirit. They had faced the shadows, they had endured the trials, they had fought the battles, and they had emerged victorious. They had found their happily ever after, not in a grand palace or a royal court, but in a simple castle, surrounded by their loved ones, their hearts filled with gratitude, their future bright with promise. Their love story, born in the crucible of adversity, had blossomed into a legend, a testament to the enduring power of hope, courage, and the unwavering strength of the human heart. It was a story that would be told for generations to come, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love can conquer all. The end.